Okay, so picture this for a second. You're at the polls, you cast your vote, and suddenly, bam, democracy vanishes.
Just like that.
Not through some dramatic coup or anything, but because, well, enough people, maybe even you listening right now, voted for it to happen.
Now, that's a chilling thought, and it's the central warning in Heather Cox Richardson's book, Democracy Awakening.
Exactly. And the kicker is, this isn't some dystopian future. She's talking about American history.
Right, she's pulling back the curtain on how democracies, ones that seem totally solid, can crumble from the inside.
Which is why we're doing this deep dive. We're going to break down how that happens, and more importantly, what it means for us here and now.
Richardson's main point is that American democracy, it's not a guarantee, it's something we got to constantly work at.
That's like a plant, right?
Right.
You can't just water it once and expect it to thrive forever.
Exactly. It needs constant attention, awareness to stop it from, backsliding. And that's what makes her book so fascinating and honestly a little unnerving, especially today.
Okay, so let's dig into this whole idea of people willingly giving up power to autocrats. That seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does, right? But Richardson uses the example of Germany in the 1930s to show how democracies are often more vulnerable to failing from within than from outside forces.
Wow, that's scary. It makes you think about how easily fear or even just really persuasive speech can be used to manipulate us.
Absolutely. And what's even more unsettling is how these historical patterns, they echo in today's political landscape.
Oh, you mean like how history seems to rhyme?
Exactly. For example, Richardson draws a direct line between the rhetoric used by enslavers in the South back in the 1850s, who believed they were inherently superior and destined to rule, to some of the language we're hearing today. It's eerie, almost, how much those arguments repeat themselves.
Like this pattern just keeps popping up. And it gets even scarier when you think about those in power actively suppressing the rights of others, like during Reconstruction after the Civil War.
Right, you had this brief glimmer of hope with Black Americans gaining political power, only to see it ripped away.
And the methods used then, the KKK, voter suppression, it was brutal, all designed to maintain a certain power structure.
Yeah, it's a harsh reminder of how fragile progress can be.
And it's not always outright violence either. Richardson also talks about these myths we tell ourselves, like the whole romanticized American cowboy thing, and how that plays a role in this erosion of democracy.
You mean that yeehaw, rugged individualism ideal?
Exactly. We get so caught up in that, we forget about the government's role in westward expansion
Yeah.
and how that feeds into arguments today about limiting government power.
Right, it's very selective storytelling. You emphasize individual effort, but downplay the need for collective action, for a shared responsibility. Richardson argues that this kind of selective memory can be used to justify policies that really only benefit a select few.
Which leads us right into the backlash against the civil rights movement. Another example of states' rights being used to resist federal power and uphold racial inequality.
And sadly, that argument is still being used today, often as a way to block progress and maintain the existing power structures, usually at the expense of marginalized groups.
It's kind of wild how these historical echoes just keep popping up.
It is, and that's exactly why Richardson's work is so important. By understanding these historical patterns, we can hopefully spot them when they're happening now and maybe, just maybe, break the cycle.
Okay, so before the break, we were getting into how fragile these democracies can be and all the ways folks in power have chipped away at them throughout history. Now, I really want to look at how those historical patterns connect to what we're seeing play out in America today.
And that's where this idea of a liberal consensus comes in, right? Richardson talks about this time period after World War II where there was a lot of agreement about the role of government in things like, economic well-being and expanding civil rights.
Like everyone just took a breath after some seriously intense times, the war, the depression.
Exactly. People were ready for some stability and a more active role for the government. Well, that seemed to provide it.
Makes sense.
Think of programs like the New Deal, the GI Bill, the Civil Rights Act. These weren't fringe ideas. They had massive support from both parties because folks saw the value.
Okay, so then what went wrong? How did we go from this we're all in this together thing to, well, whatever this is that we have now?
Well, Richardson argues this consensus started to come undone with this rise of what she calls movement conservatism.
Movement conservatism.
Yeah, and a key figure in this shift is William F. Buckley, Jr.
Okay.
He wrote this book, God and Man at Yale, where he argued that traditional conservatism, the kind that favored slow change, respecting institutions, it wasn't enough to push back against what Buckley saw as the dangers of liberalism.
So wait, he wanted to like dismantle this whole liberal consensus idea. That's a pretty bold move.
It was. He believed in a much more, proactive, ideologically driven movement, one that would directly challenge the existing liberal order.
Right.
He and other movement conservatives, they saw this as a battle of ideas.
A battle.
Yeah, and they were ready to fight.
So how'd that actually work in real life? Did they like start their own political party?
It was more strategic than that. They focused on building coalitions by tapping into anxieties and resentments that were already simmering.
Oh, I
Like a prime example is Nixon's Southern strategy, where Republicans appealed to racial anxieties, especially resentment towards the civil rights movement, as a way to gain support in the South.
wow. Talk about playing the long game. But it worked, right?
It did. It was a slow burn, but it worked. They chipped away at this shared understanding of, what the government should be doing, what our values were. Slowly, they started to reshape the whole political landscape.
And it wasn't just Nixon, was it?
Oh, absolutely not. Richardson talks about Reagan using coded language, things like welfare queen, to undermine social safety nets.
Right, right.
And then there's a whole rise of right-wing media, which, Richardson argues created this echo chamber for these increasingly extreme views.
So each step builds on the last, right?
Exactly.
Until by the time we get to the 21st century, America's primed for someone like Donald Trump to step in and what, exploit all these divisions.
Exactly.
We're back. And diving right back into democracy awakening, we've been talking about how fragile democracies are and how certain forces in America have chipped away at our shared values. But now it feels like things have taken a turn from chipping away at democracy to like full-on attack mode.
Yeah, you're right. It does feel different. And Richardson thinks this escalation was amplified big time by 9/11. Suddenly, America felt vulnerable, scared, which, let's be honest, makes it easier for leaders to take advantage of the situation.
Right, like that whole we need a strong leader, no time for debate mentality. It's easy to see how that could be manipulated. And then, well, then we get reality TV, which seems totally unrelated, but Richardson connects it to politics, specifically Donald Trump.
It's a wild connection, right? But she argues that reality TV, with its focus on personality over policy, on creating your own narrative no matter what the facts are, well, it blurred the lines between entertainment and reality. And who better to walk through those blurred lines than, well, a larger-than-life businessman, star of The Apprentice,
Wait, so you're saying that by watching The Apprentice, people were basically being prepped to accept a certain kind of leader, someone who, like, doesn't play by the rules, who just wants to win no matter what.
That's what Richardson argues, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Trump built his whole brand on being this master deal maker, this guy who could bend reality to his will. And in a political world already drowning in distrust and division, that message, well, it landed.
Okay, so then things really go downhill. Richardson says Trump's presidency wasn't just more erosion, it was an all-out assault on democratic institutions. What were some of the big examples?
She points to a few things, like Trump constantly demonized anyone who disagreed with him, spread misinformation like it was oxygen, and attacked the free press relentlessly. These weren't just off-the-cuff things, these were tactics, calculated moves straight out of the authoritarian playbook.
That's chilling. And she doesn't let the Republican Party off the hook either.
Right, not at all. She says that by going along with even enabling Trump's behavior out of fear or whatever, they were complicit in this attack on democracy.
And then, of course, there's January 6th. Richardson sees that as the culmination of years of this rhetoric, of chipping away at democratic norms, and then boom, it explodes.
Exactly.
So where do we even go from here? Richardson doesn't paint the rosiest picture, but I'm hoping she leaves us with some sense of, I don't know, hope. Some way to fight back against this democratic backsliding.
She does, but she doesn't give us a simple answer. Instead, she offers something way more powerful. Awareness. A call to action. She argues that the only way to fight authoritarianism is to be vigilant, to actively participate in our democracy, to hold our leaders accountable, and to never, ever take our rights for granted.
So knowledge is power, right? The more we understand history, the better we can recognize those patterns when they pop up today. That's our best shot at not repeating the past, right?
Absolutely. And that's what makes Democracy Awakening such a crucial read, especially right now. It's not always easy to read, but it's necessary. It reminds us that democracy is not a spectator sport. It's something we have to work at constantly if we want to keep it.
That's a powerful message. So to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive into Democracy Awakening gave you some things to think about, maybe even lit a fire under you to get more engaged, to be more aware of just how fragile our democracy is. Because it is fragile.
The future isn't set in stone. We decide what it looks like.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Now get out there and make your voice heard.